we now have a logo. And we thought besides things like having early admissions to get tickets for Eastman Presents and things like that, let's find some really unique kind of events that you won't get as just a regular concert hall. And so this is really the first of those events, and I'll introduce David Peter to you in a moment. Simply to say, if you haven't gotten the flyer, I think we have some additional ones here. I want to make sure you have it. The next event, I think, is really going to be quite special. It's a side-by-side with the Eastman Wind Ensemble. What that means is, you get to sit inside one of the world's great ensembles. I would say arguably the best wind ensemble in the world. And those of us who have played in bands and orchestras know that feel. But if you haven't been inside an ensemble, it's an incredibly rich experience. One, to be sitting side by side with virtuoso players, but two, just the energy of the sound when you're within it. It's something really special. So that is going to be on Wednesday, April 19th at 4:30. And I would encourage you to come to that, invite your friends, and we should have a good time with that. Today's event is one I'm really excited about. So we have many, many special treasures at Eastman. And we tend to think of Eastman in terms of the performers we see on stage. But in fact, we employ about 100 full-time faculty members and 50 part-time faculty members. But we also employ about 150 staff members who do so many things. And many of these folks are accomplished musicians. David Peter Coppin is a very unique and special person. He is the archivist for us in the Sibley Music Library. And as he wrote to me, when asked to do this, the assumption was probably that he would bring out some of the treasures from the Sibley Library and he'd walk us through them. And that is a really special treat. But as he said, I've been an active pianist my whole career at Eastman, and there's some pieces I would like to talk about and perform that don't get performed regularly. And so I thought that was something, again, very special to both hear the background of these, it looks like we're going to have some projection, and to hear the pieces played live. So thank you for being a part of the Dean Circle. Thank you for coming to our concerts. Thank you for your financial support of our school. Please invite your friends to do those same things as well. And please join me in welcoming David Peter Coppin.
Thank you very much, Jamal. Is this turned on? Can you all hear me? Thank you. Wonderful. Good. Eyeglasses check. Being the age I am, I have to decide which pair is going to work. Okay. The bifocals will do. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here and to be speaking on a topic that is of huge fascination to me professionally and personally. Before going into that, I just want to mention that for some historical enjoyment here at school, there are 2 displays on school premises that draw on the historical riches of the library's Special Collections Department. Upstairs on the 4th floor, outside Howard Hanson Recital Hall, is a display, the first in a cycle of what will be 7 displays, exploring the historical background back of Howard Hanson's 7 symphonies, which were his claim to fame, being called the American Sibelius. That draws heavily on the Howard Hanson papers. And then across the street in the Sibley Music Library is a display that was prompted out of last year's seasons of renovations to this illustrious recital hall that we are in. Kilbourn Hall, named in honor of Mr. Eastman's mother, Maria Kilbourn Eastman. And so I've presented a display of some of the illustrious moments out of 95 years of performance history on this stage. And if anyone later on in the afternoon would be so interested, I would be happy to lead a walking tour to either of those places. So, I want to begin by reading a poem that I think these days escapes notice. It called Kilbourn Hall and was written by Professor John Slater, a highly esteemed professor of English at the University of Rochester, and also the university's designated historian in the first half of the 20th century. He was commissioned to write this for the opening of Kilbourn Hall in March 1922. Here shall music have a home. Here shall many lovers come, seeking at her inner shrine meanings intimate, divine. These four walls shall hear the strings telling of immortal things. Youth and age and music meet here beside the city street. Youth's allegro violin, love's adagio stealing in, joy's gay scherzo and caprice, and the final chords of peace. Life's sonata played for all in this dedicated hall, all who know and all who care for the fine things and the rare. In this consummated whole, Rochester shall find a soul. Dreams of years take form at last, beauty rises from the past. Mothers see more than children know, mother of music long ago. Could you dream these marble halls where the voice of beauty calls? Could you hear the harmony still uttered, still to be? Are you waiting now to hear music of the future clear? Happy mother, so to come to your everlasting home. So wrote Professor Slater for the opening of Kilbourn Hall 95 years ago this month. So the story begins, this connection between Eastman and the Eastman School and the American composer. In 1924, the young, only 27 years old, Howard Hanson, fresh from a success in Rome, 3 years studying on the Rome Prize at the American Academy in Rome, was appointed director of the Eastman School of Music, and that set the school on its course. Among his many initiatives, designs for the school, whether curricular, performance-related, or administrative, he had definite ideas about the position that the United States should occupy in the world of the creative arts, particularly music composition. And while he had been a faculty member at the College of the Pacific in San Jose, California, still earlier in his 20s, he had organized festivals of American music, where the music of native-born composers and also emigre composers could be heard and promoted. So after 1924, he wasted no time in founding one initiative after another. In 1925, he launched the so-called American Composers Concerts, founded to give aspiring composers the opportunity to hear their works performed by professional forces under professional performing conditions. He insisted that without that opportunity, a composer was as good as lost. He was careful to define what American meant. Not only native-born American composers, but also those who had emigrated to the US and adopted this nation as their own, as well as composers born to the north and to the south. Canadians, Latin Americans, Mexicans, all part of the American family. And just to mention, the very first American Composers Concert, May 1st, 1925, here in Kilbourn Hall. Howard Hanson was conductor, and the program included a work by the very young Aaron Copland called Cortège Macabre. He wrote it in Paris, where he was studying with Boulanger, and it was inspired after he and his friends went to see the German vampire film Nosferatu. Here showing you from the program from an American Composers Concert in 1926. Note the reference to unpublished compositions, and then you see there the various works that were performed. Not every one of those composers having what's now a household name, but note at the top the reference to the program being performed again for listeners added opportunity to form a consensus. That was very important to Hanson. He tried several things in the early years, playing the program straight through twice, sometimes also passing out ballots and allowing members of the audience to choose which was their favorite work. It was all important to him. And in the late 1920s, the Eastman School struck up a deal with publisher Carl Fischer. Carl Fischer, now the longest continuous functioning music publisher in the United States. But Carl Fischer missed by just 2 years the claim to fame of being the oldest publisher. Founded 1874, G. Schirmer got going in 1872. Ah, so close. Anyway, Carl Fischer became very quickly Howard Hanson's principal publisher, and he forged a deal with the company whereby they would publish noteworthy compositions by Eastman-affiliated composers, faculty members as well as distinguished alumni. And over time, that came to about 4 dozen works of music, many of which are still available on rental from the company, some of which have never gone out of print, such as Howard Hanson's Second Symphony, his Romantic Symphony. It was an interesting arrangement whereby the work was actually considered to have been published by the Eastman School of Music, copyright held by Eastman, but to Carl Fischer went sole distribution rights for all parts of the world. Then in 1931, Dr. Hanson founded his Festivals of American Music, set up along the same lines as the American Composers Concerts, but on a far grander scale. For 1 week each spring, luminaries of the musical world would gather in Rochester, composers, critics, writers, performing musicians, converging on Rochester for performances of new American works in all genres: symphonic, chamber, vocal and choral, operatic, winds and band, ballet, choreographed ballet. We had a choreographer at school for many years. And I actually counted some 486 composers were represented altogether in the festivals from their start in 1931 till the last festival in 1971. And in 1946, Dr. Hanson invited a jazz ensemble for the very first time. On this stage, April 16, 1946, the Eastman School's first ever public performance of jazz. To show you some what the programs looked like, there, 1931 for the inaugural festival. There's the calendar for the week. This festival was shorter, only 4 performances. Later on, it grew to as many as 7, 8, or 9. And see there in the first concert, Dr. Hanson ensured his own music would be represented. It was appropriate. He had founded the thing. And of course, he himself, usually the principal conductor. That second program there, pardon me, is this? Yeah, so one of the school's ensembles, the Little Symphony, which was the titular orchestra of the Phi Mu Alpha fraternity, invited to perform here, and here are some truly obscure names. The next concert was a designated American Composers Concert. So what this means is each of those composers whose names you see there were invited to be present, guests of the Eastman School of Music, to hear their works performed on site. And the last event was a dramatic work, Saji by William Grant Still. This was a massively staged, choreographed production in the Eastman Theater, and this is representative. The festivals usually closed with something big, an opera or a ballet. And because I mentioned the jazz, there is the cover of the program. Note the hedging around the language, concert in the jazz idiom. We don't want to get too close now, do we? This was early. For the Eastman School, this was still early. Howard Hanson was coming to terms with jazz. That's a subject for a presentation in and of itself. And there, the program, you see, represented the name Jack End, director of the ensemble. Mr. End, a highly creative man, Eastman graduate himself, He taught here for 3 decades. He also taught a course in popular music arrangement, and there's a really good photograph of him by a local photographer, Alexander Levinson. Jack End came back in the late 60s to become the first director of Eastman's brand new Eastman Jazz Ensemble. He was very much in the big band tradition. So there were many illustrious things in those festivals. And here in 1955, there's a photograph of audience members flocking into the Eastman Theater. If you can possibly make out there on the marquee, it mentions Howard Hanson's opera, Mary Mount, that was performed at the 1955 festival, which was the 25th annual. That 1955 festival was done up in fine style to commemorate 25 years of success. And we have a recording of this in the school archive. When Dr. Hanson walked out on the Eastman Theater stage to conduct his opera Mary Mount, he first read to the audience a telegram he had just received. As he said, "I have here a telegram from America's most famous music lover," and proceeded to read the contents, congratulating the Eastman School on all the years of success with the festivals of American music. Sincerely yours, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And in 1938, Dr. Hanson founded the Eastman Rochester Symphony Orchestra, which we could genuinely call his orchestra. He was associated with it intimately clear up until his retirement. Formed to be a pickup ensemble for the purpose of making commercial recordings of American music. He wanted a trained orchestra at which he could throw many new works every year. They would be able to sight read, perform, and record. It was an interesting experiment. There you see the 3 companies with whom in succession the school had recording contracts. RCA Victor, later after World War II, Columbia, and then very successfully from the early 50s onwards, Mercury Records. The personnel of the orchestra comprised of members of the Rochester Civic Orchestra, that was the younger sibling orchestra to the RPO. The members of the Civic Orchestra complemented by Eastman faculty and students, all of whom were performing as union members. So it was a very unique performing experience, and they were crack hot at sight reading. Hanson himself paid tribute to their sight reading prowess in a feature article in High Fidelity magazine in 1958, and there towards the bottom of the second column, he says, "Isn't this a fine little orchestra?" He says they pretty well have to be, because I throw at them as many as, and I've forgotten the number that's quoted there, but they were simply all the time sight reading new works, recording them, and sometimes also performing. There were certain occasions on which he would put them on stage to be a concert ensemble. And 1944, the first Pulitzer Prize in music coming to an Eastman composer. That year, that was to Dr. Hanson for his Symphony No. 4. To date now, we have had 9 Pulitzer Prize laureates at Eastman, 3 faculty members, Howard Hanson, Joseph Schwantner, Christopher Rouse, and 6 men of whom we're very proud. And there they are. The first was Gail Kubik. The most recent, Kevin Putz in 2012. And of course, we anticipate this list to continue to grow. So far, though, 3 faculty members, 6 composer graduates. The statistic alone speaks to the school's dynamic success in turning out composers. There is simply no argument. And then, beginning in 1952, the involvement with Mercury Records. A unique contract permitting the school to record and showcase new American works in Mercury Records' so-called Living Presence series of LPs. And I'll show you a moment what one of those jackets looked like. Both the Eastman Rochester Symphony and the Eastman Wind Ensemble were featured on Mercury Records, and Mercury Records broke new ground with this contract, because rather than requiring the performers to travel to New York City and record in their studios, Mercury sent an engineer, in fact, a very, very famous, he's quite famous throughout the recording industry, to Rochester in a specially outfitted mobile van that would park behind Eastman Theater on Swan Street. And recording was done inside the Eastman Theater. Mercury had never before done remote recording. The Eastman School was their first venture in that initiative. It was a very successful and lucrative publicity venture and performance venture for both the Eastman Rochester and the Eastman Wind Ensemble. And we have there, there's the jacket for the LP of Dr. Hanson's Symphony No. 1, the so-called Nordic Symphony, and there in the upper right-hand corner, Mercury Living Presence. That was the motto, the specific series in the Mercury catalog. The Living Presence series rested on a technological advancement whereby two channels were combined in one groove, and when transmitted to the amplifier and the loudspeaker, it permitted basically a sonic recreation of being in the concert hall or in the recording studio with all the spaciousness and depth that at that time stereophonic recording could provide. It represented at that time the most up-to-date recording technology available in the industry. And finally, in 1964, concurrent with Howard Hanson's retirement, the Institute for American Music was founded, today known as the Howard Hanson Institute for American Music. It was founded to continue, to perpetuate and continue all the various initiatives that Howard Hanson had put into place from 1925 onwards, but giving them the imprimatur, the institutional seal, if you will. And you can today read all about the activity of the Institute on the Eastman School website. There is there a complete list of commissions of new works in the last 20 years. And what was interesting in the years after Hanson retired and became the ex officio director of the Institute and the Eastman School of Music together were cited on the programs of the Festivals of American Music as co-presenters, if you will. There you see at the very top, Institute for American Music. Howard Hanson, the teacher. Well, this is a very large part of Eastman's connection to the American composer, and not something that I think historians have really yet given all the credit that is due. He was a teacher and mentor to two generations of composers graduating from the Eastman School. He taught graduate students as well as the gifted undergraduates. There was a certain mold or a certain type that he attempted to establish. He did tend to favor academics who performed on the side, and if one studies the cumulative repertoire list for the Festivals of American Music, one sees how time and time again it was the academics who were invited to be represented in the festivals, not so much the professionals, you know, the full-time composers like the George Gershwins. He did tend to favor the academics, and he wanted to turn out composers who would find active service directing schools of music and conservatories, and did, to a large measure, succeed in that. Tonality, the order of the day. There was no atonality, no 12-tone activity at the Eastman School during the years of his directorship. His ideal musical world was one that was rooted in tonality. Certainly he composed in that realm. He did write a textbook on harmonic materials of modern music, in which he discussed in depth the materials of dodecaphonic 12-tone music. So he did break some new ground himself, but as a composer, he was most at home writing and also encouraging others to write tonally based music. There's also in Hanson's work and in the students he turned out, he himself was an ardent Christian believer, and it does come out in his music with many references to the deity, to the divine. And among his students, there does tend to be a similar mindset. Howard Hanson, as a composer, was not alone in this. One other American composer with whose archives I've had extensive experience, John Philip Sousa, for example, was very steadfast in his belief in a deity, and he used to chide other composers who were not themselves believers in any kind of deity, because he believed that through composition he was honoring a gift that had been endowed by an all-powerful, all-loving deity, and Howard Hanson very much followed in that mold. And finally there, although to give him his due, it was in 1946, he did invite one of his faculty members and a student ensemble to perform jazz here in Kilbourn Hall. And in 1959, the Eastman School founded the series of what were called Arrangers' Holidays. I could do an entire afternoon on Arrangers' Holidays. So there was popular music arrangement being taught while he was director. There was a jazz ensemble, though not yet an officially known Eastman Jazz Ensemble. So although he himself didn't have anything personally to do with jazz, he allowed it to flourish. And then after his time as director, it truly took hold and was made a part of the curriculum. So I want to recognize one specific composer, student of Howard Hanson, who so closely embodied many of the things that Howard Hanson was driving home. Wayne Brewster Barlow lived in 1912-1996, PhD from Eastman in 1937, and no accident there. We see him in front of electronic apparatus. In just 1 minute, I'm going to say something about that. Dr. Barlow had 3 degrees from Eastman, and in fact, his PhD in 1937 was the first PhD in composition conferred by the University of Rochester. And there in his freshman yearbook, rather serious-looking young gent, very determined in purpose. And there on the far right, he was treasurer of his senior class. Faculty member for 41 years, exactly 1 year longer than Dr. Hanson. Accident or not, who knows. He also occupied several administrative posts. Special assistant to Dr. Hanson for programming at the Festivals of American Music, associate dean of graduate research studies, and finally closing out his career of several years as chairman of the composition faculty. A most versatile member of the organization, the kind of officer, the kind of employee every organization needs. There was no job that was thrown at him that he could not do. And finally, founded and directed the school's first electronic music studio. This is an interesting point in his career. He was an ardent and dedicated church musician, 30 years of service as organist choirmaster at St. Thomas's Episcopal Parish in Brighton, closed his professional career with 3 years of service here in our downtown community at Christ Church. Taught a course in church music at Eastman and also published several sets of organ voluntaries for the church organist. And also composed a number of works on sacred texts in response to commissions. In 1968, the Rochester Roman Catholic Diocese commissioned him to compose a large choral work for the centennial of the Catholic Diocese. And so there he is at the controls, so to speak. 10 years of service directing the school's first electronic music studio, and he wrote an article about his experience that was published in Eastman Notes in December 1980. With him, the electronic music interest, I think, was part of a larger interest in things mechanical. For one thing, during the World War II years, when many members of the faculty were called into public service, wartime service, he did a full day's work in a local musician's factory as a lathe operator. And there was an article about him in the Rochester Press. He said, well, you know, if you just step up your rhythm to 3/4, you can get a lot of work done. he was probably the most productive worker on that line, too. And in 1951, the Rochester Press acknowledged his birthday and made mention of the fact that in his leisure time he liked to build electronic gadgets. Significant. He had a Fulbright grant in 1964-65 to study what Europeans were doing in electronic music at the universities of Brussels, Ghent, and Utrecht. 1 year on a Fulbright grant. And then director Walter Hendel commissioned him in 1967. Dr. Barlow, get a studio up and running, and he did. And then finally, he was recognized very appropriately. The school commissioned him for a new composition. For the school's 50th anniversary, 1971-72, there was what was called Project 71, a series of commissions, 23 living composers commissioned to write works honoring the Eastman School's anniversary. And so in response to the commission, Dr. Barlow composed soundscapes for orchestra and electronic tape, and he conducted the premiere in the Eastman Theater, March 10, 1972. And here you see him directing the Philharmonia in rehearsal. Photographs by the late Louis Ozer, the Eastman School's de facto photographer for 4 or 5 decades. His major claim to fame as a composer is a lovely chamber work called The Winter's Past, a rhapsody for oboe and strings, also arranged for piano accompaniment, still in the active repertory and the discography. It is performed regularly and recorded, and it was published in Carl Fischer's Eastman series that Howard Hanson had founded, regularly performed at school. And this was one of the works that our Eastman Philharmonia took on a much publicized tour of Europe in the winter of 1961-62, a 3-month tour undertaken with sponsorship of the U.S. State Department. The Winter's Past was one of the works represented in the orchestra's repertory for that tour. And all in the musical family. Music was a family affair in the Barlow family. His son, Robert Bob, was an Eastman graduate, 1961 Bachelor of Music, a harpist, later DMA from Juilliard. And I want to acknowledge a classmate of our friend and colleague, Kathleen Bride. But the advantage of having a father on the faculty, there's Bob in the yearbook, 1961. And by the way, the 1961 yearbook, it wasn't formal headshots like in the past, but it was candid pictures of, seniors being photographed wherever they wanted. One was photographed smoking in bed. It was a new decade, the 1960s. Bob Barlow chose to be photographed in formal guise as a performing musician. He was a participant on the Philharmonia that went to Europe 1961-62, but claim to fame, his father composed for him a graduation present, a concerto for harp and orchestra called Images. It got him a performance in the Eastman Theater with the Eastman Rochester Symphony, Dr. Hanson conducting. He was quite fortunate. So there was a work for duo for harp and electronic tape, one of the several works Dr. Barlow wrote for electronic media, composed for Bob, who then came back and played it in honor of his dad's retirement in 1978. And when it was last performed at Eastman in the fall of 2008, it was performed not with tape, but the electronic component was produced by means of CD playback. I think Dr. Barlow would have approved. He hit upon medium of electronic tape because it was the medium of the time, but he surely was a man of progress. He would have kept pace with technological advances. And so there in April 1978, here on the stage of Kilbourn Hall, Bob warming up in rehearsal, his father with him conferring, and in that photograph there, talented son, proud father looking on, nice family photograph. And then that evening, Bob acknowledging the applause. Photographs again by the late Louis Ozer. The piano in Dr. Barlow's output. He was a gifted keyboardist himself. piano and organ. He wrote a solo sonata in 1947. He wrote a quintet in 1951. Also a trio in 1964. A really, really crackerjack work, Dynamisms for Two Pianos, 1966, deserves to be performed. And then, of course, keyboard accompaniments in his sacred works. The Sonata for Piano, which I will with pleasure play for you, was introduced in a student recital. Claire Hughes, later Mrs. Claire Heiss, April 1948, she was a candidate for the Master of Music degree. Its first public performance, so-called, was at the 1948 Festival of American Music, performed by Professor Jose Echanes, Cuban-born pianist, well-known concert pianist at the time, who served for 25 years on the Eastman faculty. The following winter, Professor Echanes performed the sonata at Town Hall in New York City. And just a footnote, Professor Echanes, much dedicated to the work of his colleagues, it was he who was the assisting pianist at the world premiere for Dr. Barlow's quintet in 1951. And there, from Professor Echanes' Town Hall recital, there you see the handbill and the program. And that program there, the lineup of works represented, that was a classic Echanes program. He specialized in the repertory of Latin American and Spanish composers, Joaquin Nin, Manuel de Falla, Antonio Soler, and in fact, he knew Manuel de Falla personally. His students all did tend to gravitate to that very interesting repertoire. And the Sonata for Piano last performed at Eastman in 1964 by DMA candidate Ernesto Lejano, who went on to a distinguished career teaching in Canada. He is no longer, he has passed. And more recently, the sonata has been performed in Freiburg, Germany in 2002 by the late, she has passed now, Ko Ryoki, who was a teacher at the Domingschule in Freiburg. And so, with my pleasure, I would like to play for you the Sonata for Piano by Wayne Barlow. The next piece I've chosen is a personal choice, not so much an institutional choice, but it reflects my own personal music journey during the years, 18 years now that I've been in the school's employ, because being up close to the documents, the historical documents, in the course of my job, I am privileged to have my hands on the history more or less at all times. And what the proximity to this history has done for me has given me an appreciation and knowledge of American music I never would have acquired otherwise. And so one of the pieces that I have studied while I have been here at school, and I've been privileged to study this piece with Dr. Douglas Humphreys, chairman of the piano faculty with whom I've taken instruction in several past semesters. The Sonata Number 2 by Ned Rorem. Ned Rorem, American composer, born 1923, Pulitzer Prize winner in 1976. Much celebrated for his vocal music and opera. 2 years ago, Eastman Opera Theater, with great success, mounted a production of his opera, Our Town. The piano is his own instrument, and he's composed 3 piano sonatas, but we do tend to think of Rorem more as a vocal and operatic composer, but I think the piano writing is definitely worth a hearing. A survey of Eastman concert programs indicates that to date, no Eastman degree candidate has yet performed the Rorem Second Sonata, but I do very much hope that Eastman pianists will change that reality. The Second Sonata in 4 short movements, there's a story. He initially conceived it in 3 movements, but then an American pianist named Julius Katchen, who lived 1926 till 1969, who lived in Europe, got hold of the piece and said to Rorem, I want you to write a new concluding movement for me, something big. And by the way, can you also write me a concerto? So the 2 men, they enjoyed a fruitful working relationship. On the score of the Second Sonata, at the top of the last movement, to Julius Katchen, dedicated to Mr. Katchen. And Rorem did compose a masterful concerto, his second piano concerto for Mr. Katchen, which Katchen premiered in 1954. The Second Sonata of Ned Rorem. On the subject of the Eastman School and the American composer, I think, well, already we have a start on that history in written form. Our designated historian, Professor Vincent Lenti, ranking member on the faculty, he was appointed in 1962, the last remaining appointee of Dr. Howard Hanson. He has certainly addressed in print a good deal of that relationship as it was enacted in the time of Howard Hanson's directorship. But with the ongoing work of the Howard Hanson Institute, it is a very exciting time. And I think for me, as an employee of the school, the daily excitement really comes from it's always something new, nothing stands still, but simultaneously always learning something new about the institution's past histories. So I know there's going to be a reception. Thank you all very, very much for coming today. I do invite you to visit the Ruth T. Watanabe Special Collections on the 4th floor of the Music Library. We welcome, I and my very capable team, we welcome intellectual curiosity, questions at all times. So thank you all very, very much.